James had always heard about the old house just outside the town. It was one of those local legends that no one could trace back to a definitive source. All he knew was that, for as long as anyone could remember, the house had stood empty. Rumor had it that people who stayed there never made it through the night. A rational man, James didn't believe in such nonsense, but the house had piqued his curiosity. After a particularly long day at work, he decided to drive out there. He parked his car by the overgrown driveway, grabbed his flashlight, and walked towards the faded, crumbling structure. The porch creaked under his weight, and the door, surprisingly, was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, revealing a wide foyer shrouded in darkness. The air was heavy and thick with dust. He shined his flashlight around, illuminating the peeling wallpaper, the sagging ceiling, and the debris-strewn floor. As he ventured deeper into the house, the silence was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards under his feet seemed amplified in the stillness. But then, there was another sound, a soft shuffling, just beyond the beam of his flashlight. He stopped and listened, his heart pounding. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving upstairs. James swallowed hard. Old houses make noise, he reminded himself. He continued forward, but the footsteps upstairs mirrored his every move, as if someone, or something, was pacing along with him. He stood frozen for a moment, staring up at the ceiling. The sound stopped too, and then, without warning, there was a loud bang from the second floor, as if a door had been slammed shut with incredible force. He flinched, his breath catching in his throat. The flashlight flickered, and in the dim beam, he thought he saw a shadow dart across the hallway ahead of him. "Hello?" he called out, though his voice trembled more than he intended. There was no response, only the oppressive quiet once again. Determined to prove to himself that it was nothing, James made his way to the staircase. He ascended slowly, each step groaning beneath him. When he reached the landing, the air was colder, unnaturally so, like he had just stepped into a freezer. Ahead of him was a long hallway lined with several doors. One of them stood wide open, the one that had slammed shut moments before. As he approached it, a soft whispering filled the air. At first, it was indistinct, like wind slipping through the cracks in the walls, but the closer he got, the more it began to form words. Words he couldn't understand, but that were undeniably human. The flashlight flickered again, and suddenly the whispering stopped. The door ahead of him creaked open wider, and James felt a chill run down his spine. His instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run, but he forced himself to step forward. As he crossed the threshold into the room, the door behind him slammed shut. The flashlight blinked out, leaving him in pitch darkness. For a moment, everything was still, and then there was a sound, a breath, slow and ragged, coming from the corner of the room. He swung the flashlight around, desperately clicking the button, trying to bring it back to life. When it finally flickered on, the beam landed on the corner, but there was nothing there. Yet the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked loudly behind him. He spun around, and the flashlight went out once again. The air was thick with a presence, something that James couldn't see but could feel, pressing in on him. His chest tightened, and the air felt colder still. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him from all directions. He backed into the corner, his breathing rapid and shallow. Then the walls began to groan, the wood shifting as if the entire house was alive and moving around him. A soft scraping sound echoed through the room, like nails dragging across wood, and James could feel his knees begin to buckle. His head swam, the whispers growing louder, almost deafening now, and the cold pressed in around him like an invisible hand. And then it all went dark. James awoke sometime later, lying face down on the side of the road, just outside the house. His car was parked where he had left it, the engine still cool to the touch. He felt dazed, disoriented, and weak. The house loomed silently in the distance, its windows black and lifeless. For a long time he sat there, trying to piece together what had happened. His body felt heavy, his mind foggy, and the last thing he could remember was the cold and the whispers. He never spoke of the house again. No one ever asked. But every time he drove past Willow Creek Road after that night, he kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to even glance in the direction of the house. Cassie had heard the stories growing up. Everyone in her small town just outside Clarksdale, Mississippi, knew about the old, decaying house along Highway 61. They called it the Wailing House because people swore they heard strange, ghostly cries echoing from the ruins at night. Some claimed it had once belonged to a wealthy family who mysteriously disappeared in the 1920s. Others whispered about a tragic fire, but no one seemed to know the full truth. Cassie didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but when her best friend Kyle dared her to spend just one night in the old house, she couldn't say no. It was the kind of small-town challenge that had been passed down for generations, one that few ever accepted. On a warm autumn evening, Cassie drove out to the old house, her headlights cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in over the highway. The house sat just beyond the tree line, barely visible from the road, its roof sagging, windows broken, and front porch overgrown with weeds. The air smelled faintly of mildew and damp earth, and the distant hum of insects filled the evening stillness. She parked her car on the side of the road, grabbing her flashlight and a small backpack with snacks and water. The dare was simple: spend the night in the house until sunrise. No one had ever lasted more than a few hours. Cassie crossed the creaking front porch and pushed open the door. It groaned on its rusted hinges, and the smell of rotting wood hit her as soon as she stepped inside. Dust swirled in the beam of her flashlight, revealing peeling wallpaper and cracked floorboards. The house felt like it had been abandoned for decades, untouched except by time. She walked through the foyer, her footsteps echoing unnervingly loud in the silence. The air was thick, heavy with a chill that hadn't been outside. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Cassie found a spot in the large, empty living room where a few broken chairs and a crumbling fireplace hinted at the life that had once been here. She set her backpack down and turned on her flashlight, trying to ignore the strange sense of unease that was starting to creep over her. The first hour passed uneventfully. She walked through the downstairs rooms, finding little of interest beyond old furniture and crumbling walls. But as the night wore on, a strange tension began to fill the air. The wind outside picked up, causing the house to groan and creak in protest. And then she heard it. A low, distant wailing sound, barely audible at first. It was faint, like the cry of an animal carried on the wind. Cassie froze, her heart skipping a beat. She pointed her flashlight toward the staircase leading to the second floor, where the sound seemed to be coming from. "Old houses make noises," she whispered to herself, trying to shake off the rising dread. But the wailing grew louder, more distinct, like someone, or something, was crying in pain. Cassie's throat tightened. The rational part of her mind told her it was just the wind whistling through the broken windows, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. Against her better judgment, she slowly made her way up the stairs, each step groaning under her weight. The sound of her own breathing filled her ears, but underneath it, the wailing continued, growing closer, more desperate. At the top of the stairs, she paused, her flashlight sweeping across the second-floor landing. There were several doors, all of them slightly ajar, leading into dark, shadowy rooms. The wailing seemed to be coming from the far end of the hallway, where the last door stood wide open. Cassie's hand shook as she approached the door. The wailing was louder now, almost like a human voice crying out in anguish. She stepped through the doorway and found herself in what had once been a bedroom. The air was colder here, and the smell of smoke hung faintly in the air, like a fire that had long since gone out. The room was empty except for a broken bed frame and a shattered mirror hanging crooked on the wall. But the wailing, it was so loud now, so close. Cassie shined her flashlight around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just emptiness. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. She spun around, her heart pounding, but no one was there. The wailing stopped. Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket, suffocating and thick. Cassie's pulse raced as she grabbed the doorknob, twisting it frantically, but the door wouldn't budge. It was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Then she heard it again, but this time it wasn't wailing. It was whispering, a soft, breathy voice, so faint she could barely make out the words. "Help me. Please. Help me." Cassie backed away from the door, her skin crawling. The voice seemed to come from the very walls themselves, surrounding her. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. "Help me. It's not safe. It's coming." Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the air felt thick, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Her flashlight flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. Cassie's breath came in shallow gasps as she fumbled for her phone, trying to turn on its light. But the moment she did, the whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down her spine. The temperature dropped even further, and Cassie could see her breath hanging in the air. The growling grew louder, closer, as if something was standing right behind her. She didn't dare turn around. Instead, she ran toward the door, pounding on it, screaming for it to open. But the more she screamed, the more the growling intensified, filling the room with an unnatural sound that made her skin prickle with terror. Suddenly, the door flew open, and Cassie stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. She didn't stop to look back. She ran down the stairs, her heart thundering in her chest, the house creaking and groaning around her as though it were alive. She burst through the front door and out onto the porch, collapsing onto the overgrown lawn. The house loomed behind her, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. Cassie lay there for a long time, staring up at the starless sky, her breath ragged and shallow. Eventually, she forced herself to stand, her legs trembling as she made her way back to her car. Riley had always been fascinated by history, especially the darker side of it. That's why, during a road trip through Pennsylvania, he decided to visit Eastern State Penitentiary, one of the most infamous prisons in the United States. Built in 1829, it was once known for its harsh isolation practices and the dark, oppressive atmosphere that still clung to its crumbling walls. The tour was supposed to be during the day, with guides and tourists exploring the prison's decaying cell blocks. But Riley, seeking a more authentic experience, stayed behind until closing time, slipping unnoticed into one of the less visited sections of the prison. It was in Block 14, a wing that hadn't been restored, its metal bars rusted, doors hanging off their hinges. The shadows were long and the air smelled damp, like wet stone. As dusk fell, the last group of tourists left the grounds and the prison became eerily quiet. Riley, flashlight in hand, wandered the empty halls, the history of the place settling heavily in his chest. He had read stories about Eastern State, about the isolation, the suffering, and the strange occurrences that people claimed happened after dark. But like most things, he didn't believe in the supernatural. He was here for the history, for the thrill of being in such a notorious place when it was abandoned by everyone else. He found himself standing in the middle of cell block 14. The narrow hallway stretched out before him, lined with empty cells, their doors hanging ajar. His flashlight's beam bounced off the cold, cracked walls. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the growing unease that seemed to be settling in his stomach. That's when he heard it. A soft, dragging sound coming from the far end of the block. He froze, listening intently. It could have been the wind, or maybe an animal, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. He pointed his flashlight down the corridor but saw nothing. The dragging continued, the sound of something heavy being pulled across the floor. His heart raced, but he forced himself to take a few steps forward, determined to figure out what was causing it. As he moved closer, the dragging sound stopped. Riley exhaled, relieved but still on edge. He reached the end of the block where a large rusted iron door stood slightly ajar, leading into an old, disused solitary confinement wing. He nudged the door open, and it screeched loudly, echoing through the empty corridors. The room beyond was pitch black, his flashlight barely penetrating the darkness. The air inside was colder than the rest of the prison, and a faint metallic smell lingered in the air. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered. He tapped it against his palm, trying to steady the beam. That's when he saw something. Just a brief glimpse, a shadow darting from one corner of the room to the other. He swung the flashlight around, but it flickered again, and the shadow was gone. His pulse quickened, but he told himself it was just his imagination. Old places like this are creepy, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the feeling that he wasn't alone. The sound of soft, shallow breathing came from behind him. Riley's blood ran cold. He turned sharply, shining his flashlight back down the corridor, but there was nothing there, just the empty cells and the oppressive silence. He took a step back, his heart thudding in his chest, and then he heard it again, this time closer. The breathing was slow and labored, as if someone was standing just out of sight, struggling for air. Riley's mouth went dry. He turned on his heel and started walking back the way he came, his footsteps echoing louder than before. The breathing followed him, growing louder, heavier, until it felt like it was right behind him. He quickened his pace, trying to stay calm, but the air seemed to thicken around him, the cold seeping into his bones. As he neared the entrance to Block 14, he stopped dead in his tracks. One of the cell doors, which had been hanging open when he arrived, was now slammed shut. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second he saw a figure standing just behind the bars, silent, motionless. And then the flashlight went out. In the darkness, the breathing returned, louder than ever. Riley's hands shook as he fumbled with the flashlight, trying desperately to get it working again. The darkness pressed in around him, suffocating, and the breathing drew closer. Just as the panic threatened to overwhelm him, the flashlight sputtered back to life. He swept the beam across the cell block, but the figure was gone. The door that had slammed shut was wide open again. Heart pounding, he ran. He didn't stop until he reached the main entrance, throwing himself against the heavy wooden doors. They were locked, of course. They had been locked for hours. For a moment, he stood there, gasping for air, his back pressed against the cold stone wall. Then, slowly, the temperature dropped again, and a soft, echoing whisper began to fill the corridor. Riley didn't wait to hear what it was saying. He turned, sprinting down the length of the prison, navigating the halls blindly until he finally found the exit to the courtyard. The gates were closed but unlocked. He shoved them open and ran until the prison was far behind him. The next thing he knew, he was lying on the sidewalk just outside Eastern State. His head was pounding, his clothes soaked in sweat. It was dark now, the streets empty. He looked back at the massive stone structure, its looming towers silent and still. His car was parked where he had left it, keys still in the ignition. Without a second glance, he jumped in and drove away, leaving Eastern State and whatever had been inside those walls behind him. He never went back, and he never told anyone what happened. Some stories, he realized, weren't meant to be shared.